We'll make a start, everybody. Welcome everyone to our this is our fifth and final for this year, 2021, Community Wealth Building Workshop. For those of you attending, for the first time, I'm Liz McEntee, Chair of EDAS. And once again, I'm delighted to be hosting this partnership event with the Scottish Government and COSLA, led by CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. Our theme for today is around the next steps for community wealth building, with a focus on procurement and financial powers. As ever, we're in the safe hands of Neil McEnroy, Chief Executive of CLES, and we have a great lineup of speakers today, namely Callum Ian McIver, who's Community Director with the Western Isles Council, Gordon Mole, Chief Officer for Business and Employability with Fife Council, Val McNeice, Programme Manager, Health and Inclusive Growth at NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Glasgow City Council, and Julie McLachlan, who's Senior Manager, Economic Policy with North Ayrshire Council. Now, I'll say a bit more about, by way of introduction to each of our speakers as we move through the agenda, but can I thank you, all of you who are here today to speak, for being here and to share your expertise and perspectives on this really important agenda across Scotland. And also welcome to everybody who's joining us now on this really beautiful spring day. I hope everyone's feeling optimistic about how things are moving ahead now that we had all the announcements yesterday. It does feel as though there is finally light at the end of a very long tunnel. And if you're anything like me, you'll have been desperately trying to get a hair appointment and put together successfully for the beginning of April. Now, our final session builds on our previous sessions where we looked at the theory and 5 pillars of community wealth building and community wealth building in action, the role of community anchors and inclusive ownership, and land and property. Now, you can still see and access recordings of these earlier sessions on the EDAS website if you missed them, as the purpose of our events, as those of you have attended before know, is to share as widely as possible information, tools and how-to guides on community wealth building for those who are either thinking about, in the process of developing and or implementing such approaches across Scotland. We've generated a large and regular audience for these events too, so even though we're not meeting in person, I hope you've been able to build some connections with others in this community wealth building community over the last few months, and we certainly encourage you to do that again today. You will be sent a recording of this event, as well as any slides and details of chat box commentary. So I suppose what I'd ask is that you kind of, just sit back, enjoy the presentations today, and reflect on how it's relevant for the work that you're doing or that you're planning to take forward. As is the norm, we've muted participants except for those who are speaking, but we do encourage you to add any comments or questions to the chat box. And we've got time in the agenda to focus on these. Now, we're slightly altering the agenda today. I think from the one that I think you were sent. Our first speaker, or guest speaker, is going to be Gordon Mole. We're just swapping around Gordon and Callum for the purposes of today's session. And we're also going to tighten up a little bit on the length of those presentations. So we have about 7 minutes for each speaker, so we can allow about 3 minutes of any questions that we can take from the floor. Again, we would love it if you're brave enough to raise your hand and actually speak. It's good to see people and get a bit of interaction, but if you're not as comfortable with that, it's fine just to post your questions in the chat box and we'll take it from there. Then we've got our usual kind of 2 hours for the workshop. We will squeeze in a short comfort break of about 5 minutes, just around about 3 o'clock, so people can perhaps refresh coffee, etc. So that's, I think, all of the kind of practical issues I need to cover today. Once again, thanks for being here, and over to you, Neil, to begin the session with a reminder of what we've covered, really, I think, so far in our 5 sessions, but then also to provide some context on today's theme of procurement and financial powers. Okay.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Liz. I wouldn't know you need a haircut. Looks fine. Good to have yourself.
Plaster will get you everywhere.
Let me just get these slides up, folks. Now, have I got the right ones? Can you see that okay? Can you see that, Liz?
Not yet, Neil.
Can you see that?
Nope.
Nope.
No.
I always have this problem. Let's see if we can come out of that. Start again. Is that working?
No, not yet.
Nope. I'll share my screen
The
now.
hand? Yeah, from Alison, maybe.
You go for it, Alison? Aye. All right. Sorry about that, folks.
That's it.
Great. Sorry about that, folks. Hello. Just to start the first slide, just the opening slide there, Alison. Go back. Aye. Just hi everyone, and I'm Neil McNamara. I'm the Chief Executive of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, who have been in the vanguard of community wealth building now for a number of years. I'm also part-time seconded the Scottish Government, the Economic Development Directorate, as a community wealth building advisor. And I suppose as we've been going through these sessions, the last four, you know, the world hasn't stopped, of course. It's been moving at pace, and community wealth building moving at pace, and there's been a lot happening. So it's been great doing these, but also been refining things as we go along. And so what I want to do here is just to recap where we've got up to, and talk a little bit about finance and procurement power, because I know some of you in the call will not have been to those sessions. So next slide, please, Alison. Next slide, please, Alison. Great. So what is community wealth building? Well, it's a people-centred approach to local economic development, which looks to increase the flow of wealth back into local economies and places by giving more control to local people and business. We covered this in the first session, of course, and it's very much a maturing, if not a transformation or reset to economic development. This is about making sure that as we think about economic development policy and economic development activity, we're hot wiring in social and environmental benefits into the economic activity itself. Now, traditionally in economic development, we've either thought about, let's get the growth, and the growth will provide the dividends for us all, or let's get the growth, and then with that growth, we'll redistribute some of that wealth through transfer payments, welfare, regeneration, and so forth. Community wealth building is for all that, but there's one vital difference, is that has been not as important as it could have been, not been as good an outcomes as it could have been, that redistributing process. So community wealth building says, let's think about pre-distribution. This is actually about, as the economy functions, how do we make sure that we're accruing social, local economic and environmental benefits as the economy actually works, as the economy actually keeps ticking on. And in that, as we've explored in previous sessions, ownership in the economy is crucially important. Who owns the economic activity and who gains from that economic activity? And we explored that a lot in the first session in terms of wages and capital and who owns capital and so forth. Some people say, and maybe some of you think, well, community wealth building, we've been doing it for ages. We've always been doing it, and now we're just doing it a bit more. Well, it's actually a full frontal attack, if you like, in some ways, of how we do economics and how we do economic development, because it's kind of saying we need to own more of the economy ourselves, and we need to do and make it work for ourselves more. It's much more, if you like, about changing about the very nature of an economy, that from the word economos, keeper of the household, making sure that the economy works for us, our homes, our people, our communities. So it's very much systemic change of the economy, dealing with some of the things that went very wrong with the economy in terms of social inclusion, local economic benefit, and environmental climate emergency. So that's broadly the theory we covered in the first session. Next one, please. Now, what's happening in Scotland is there's a rollout in a number of areas, and obviously North Ayrshire, and you'll hear from Julie McLaughlin later on, who's been on that journey for a while now. Clackmannanshire, we heard from Debbie Carter in a previous session. They have now had an action plan, and that's been completed, and then they're moving to delivery. Tay Cities and Fife, they also had an action plan, and now moving to delivery, and you'll hear from Gordon Moll later on. Glasgow City Region, they were different, didn't cover all the aspects of community wealth building, just two aspects. They've got action plans completed and now moving to delivery, and you'll hear from Val McNeice later on. Western Isles, we've not finished the action plan yet, we're in a draft stage, and you'll hear from Callum E. McKeever later on. And South of Scotland, that's ongoing, that work. It's focused on housing, housing as housing associations anchors. That will be completed by April, the end of April. The plan for all these action plans is to plan, do the actions, get some outcomes, learn, show, highlight, and repeat. There's a snowballing model to what we're trying to do here in Scotland. These 5 areas have been specifically supported by the Scottish Government. North Ayrshire did stuff in their own bat, but obviously I've got some, if you like, ongoing support in kind from the Scottish Government. And there's other areas now doing it under their own steam. South Lanarkshire, their strategy was announced last week, I think, and also there's a number of other locations, and I know a number of you in your call will also be pursuing it in your own location, but also in your own organisation. It's also gaining traction with many national stakeholders like the Scottish Enterprise, and I know Brian Connolly's on this call, NHS and COSLA colleagues are all pushing on this. So it is a practical, common sense move to actually ensure that more of us Scots actually have a genuine stake in the economy and the wealth that's produced. And it's very much a maturing, if not a reset, to how in sense we think about economic development. Next one, please. Now, there is 5 pillars, and for those that's heard this recap before or seen bits of this presentation before, this is a new diagram that the Scottish Government's produced. We've got new infographics around this community wealth building, which is all very nice, and thanks to my colleague Laura Warku, who's been working on those. There's 5 pillars to community wealth building, and in all the sessions we've discussed them. And the last one we discussed land and property and inclusive ownership in detail, which was a fantastic session. And today we'll have a little bit of conversation about spending and finance as pillars. Next one, please, Alison. It's important just to recall, we talked about this, I think in session 2 of the sessions around the role of anchor institutions. And just to remind you, these are important because these large institutions, many of them public institutions, of course, hold a lot of wealth. They own a lot of assets, they employ a lot of people, they spend a lot of resources, and in a sense they can be probably worth up to 35–40% of the whole Scottish economy, public spending if you like. And so these anchor organisations have a big role within our economy, and it's important we think about how they use their wealth. And unlike commercial economic wealth, which is obviously private wealth is fundamentally important, this wealth does have a special quality in that it's democratic wealth. Public institutions, health boards, local authorities, in a sense, is our money. So we need to make sure that is acts virtuously and flows very effectively through an economy. And there is a focus on community wealth building on those anchor institutions. And that's, we'll hear a little bit from that from Val, I'm sure. We had a little bit from Lisa Buck previously. And also the work that is ongoing in the south of Scotland with the housing, that our registered social landlord sector is very important to this regard. Next one, please, Alison. We talked, I think, in the 3rd session about theories of change, and we talked about, I talked about the metaphors of snowballs, wedges. You know, this process of community wealth building is very much about snowballing things, starting from small things and growing. Wedges, starting with a thin end of a wedge to make a change in a particular activity, and then the thick end of the wedge follows from that experience, that pointed moment into kind of change. And all that, I think, as we explored in the 3rd session, is part of a radical social innovation tradition where, and it goes back to that Scottish phrase, mony a mickle makes a muckle. Many a small thing makes a lot. Let's try small things. Let's make that small thing really work well. And then we start to do more and more of it. It foreshadows bigger change. So this is the theory of change model we have. It's very much about starting from where we are, starting small and building. And in community wealth building, we start from the aim of creating a flow of wealth back into local economies and places, give more control to local people and businesses, and work backward from that goal. That's the sort of theory of change philosophy, the like and concept that we explored in session 3. Next one, please, Alison. And just touch upon very briefly, I'm conscious of time, and I want to definitely hear from our 4 speakers and giving them good time to explore where they are and where they're going next. But just a little bit about some of the thinking that's been happening around the spending and finance pillars in recent weeks and months. Next one, please, Alison. Firstly, on spending, Now, spending is a key element of demand, particularly public sector spending, a key element of demand. And it's key that we think about that spending, how that relates to ownership and supply. Now, that connection, the connection with what we spend as a nation, what we spend as anchor institutions, and how that relates to supply out there in the economy, the supply, and how that relates to different forms of ownership is increasing in importance, I think, across Scotland and in the community wealth building areas specifically. This sense that the money we spend is not just getting the best price. This is actually an economic and business development lever of that money that we spend. I think that's happening much, much more. And the pandemic, I think, has made us think differently about that spending in many ways. And as the economy has shrunk, what's happening is that public spending is more crucial and there's more of a push and stress on procurement. So this is a very important pillar, but I think it's growing in importance, arguably. Community benefits, of course, they're growing in importance to get as much as we can from that Scottish public pound, if you like. Now, there's worries around community benefits at the moment because we might be squeezing the business too much to ask for these community benefits, particularly in a post-COVID situation. So there's a little bit of a worry coming around there, I think. Also with community benefits, it's really, really important. I think it's coming out clearer now. Not all sectors are the same. A catering sector is very different to a construction sector, very different to an office furniture sector, very different to a retail sector. And all of those sectors have a different ability to actually respond to community benefits. Typically, construction sector has been quite good in responding to community benefits. Maybe other sectors are not quite so good. So there is sectoral differences to community benefits, and that granular understanding is very, very important. If we're sitting there in North Ayrshire and you're thinking about how do all those anchors start to use their spend to grow community benefits, some of the sectors may be able to respond to community benefits very well. Some of them may not be able to because of the nature of their industry and the demands are placed upon them or the vulnerabilities of those sectors. So that's, I think, an important point around community benefits that's coming out in recent months and weeks. We're finding that with public sector procurement, we do have excellent policy and excellent support for procurement in Scotland. And I'll be interested to see what the speakers have to say about this, but I think it's not always followed through in practice in procurement. And I think there's an issue of capacity, I think we're finding, and perhaps issues of status of procurement. As we say in the community wealth building world, procurement is economic development lever. No, it is a huge corporate policy lever. And perhaps in some instances it's not got that status. It's seen as very much a technical process just to spend some money and get what we need. It's much more important than that. We're also seeing in spending the community benefit wish list. This is a more of a pre-contract engagement with communities to see what they would like from community benefits, and that allowing that to bend the asks of contracts that fit the local community desires in terms of what they would like to see in a community and the extent to which the market of supply could perhaps deliver some of those community benefit desires, wants, needs, if you like. So there is a maturing and a changing emphasis of some elements of community benefit through the community wealth building work. I think, as I've said, the link between procurement and supply is growing, but analysis and a forethought is key. This is the pipeline. Imagine you're sitting there and you've got to procure a big construction contract. It's actually to think through, hold on here, in 6 months' time, we will be building a bridge. Yeah. What do we need for that bridge? Who is around in the supply market that provide the stuff we need for that bridge? How do we animate that supply to bid for that contract that's coming up? Analysis of what you need in procurement commissioning terms and a forethought is kind of key. And I think we're seeing some of that supply chain development work growing quite significantly in Scotland through community wealth building. We're also seeing in spending that our things like the growth deals, very much thinking about how community wealth building plays into them, particularly the business cases and the procurement aspects around those business cases, and that is growing in importance. And possibly, I think Julie from North Ayrshire may touch very briefly on that. And of course, we're starting to see in procurement bespoke frameworks that very much relate to the place, bespoke community benefit frameworks and so forth. So there is a range of stuff around spending that I touched upon in previous sessions, but also I just wanted to update you a little bit in terms of what the latest thinking is around spending. Next one, please, and the final one, please, Alison. In finance, I mean, finance is very much is seen in community wealth building as the oil. It's the lubricant between supply. Well, it's a lubricant of supply and lubricant of demand, lubricant of the space between supply and demand. And I think if we don't have effective financial ecosystem, you'll have a stickiness, a clunkiness between the things that we demand and what is supplied to it. So we do need to have this effective flow of finance. And of course, at the heart of the finance pillar is this understanding that finance needs to work for our communities. This is not about finance, which is in the vagaries of extraction of wealth, where the wealth we produce is squirreled off to far off places that have no attachment or link to Scotland, distant shareholders. This is finance that works for us. It's recirculation of finance, decent finance, ethical finance that works truly for us. I think in finance, I think there is a real worry, I think, around that we're hearing in the localities we're working of when the furlough and the business loan schemes come to end. Have they to date created a bit of a dam? So that's a very bad spelling. It's dam, DEM, not dam as in dash it. A dam as in DEM. Created a dam of personal and business insecurity. There's a sense that it's kind of been a holding back, if you like, a whole wave. Once these schemes end, a wave of business failure and a wave of unemployment. And with that, when that actually is released, I think there'll be huge levels of business and personal insecurity. So the financial ecosystem that sits around that, both business finance, but also individual personal finance, I think is going to be really, really important, and community wealth building needs to speak much to this. There's increased pressure on all public side finances and linked to the spending point to be more catalytic and think about the ripple effects of that public sector spending. There is increasing pressure put on pension funds, particularly our public sector pension funds, in terms of ethical investment and divesting of things from fossil fuels and so forth. And some pension funds are starting through pressure from local councillors sitting on pension funds, pension fund committees, to start to ask more difficult questions about the investment portfolios of those pension funds. And that's coming partly about through the pressure from community wealth building. The credit union and community development finance initiatives are robust, and I think they're moving and growing into a space and helping both personal finance, community finance, and I think increasingly we'll move into forms of business finance. And then we're also seeing deeper ideas around community wealth funds, either endowment based on dormant assets held by the banking sector, or accrued income through things like community energy. And that's certainly something that's emerging in areas where there's a concentration of community energy owned schemes, and how that can be pooled underneath our community wealth funds that are actually then recirculated and help to finance a new innovation and creativity within the local economy. So that's been a canter through a bit of a recap, a little bit of a kind of focus on those two pillars. Now I'm going to pass you back to Liz, who will begin the next session with our assembled speakers from the 4 localities. Thanks very much, and thanks for doing the slides, Alison. Sorry for messing up to begin with.
Thanks very much, Neil. I think that was really excellent summary and really kind of good resume for those who haven't been at all of the sessions. of what's been covered at each of the sessions. As I say, you can catch up with all of that on the EDAS website, because we do have recordings of each of the sessions if you want to get more information. I think it was also really helpful for you to give an update in terms of where things are at just now, because we started these sessions last year. Actually, quite a lot has been evolving, even in just the time that we've been running the 5 events. So really good to see where the kind of thinking is just now and some of the themes that we've been discussing. So we're now going to move on to our speakers for today, who will each be addressing the question, where are we now and what comes next in the context of the organisations that they work for and also the geographic locales where they are based. And as I said at the beginning, we're shifting the agenda slightly. First up, we've got Gordon Mole, who's Chief Officer for Business Employability with Fife Council. And Gordon is the Council's Senior Lead for Employability, Economic Development, Economic Policy, Town Centres and Tourism, leading on the development of 5 projects for the Edinburgh and South East Scotland and Tay Cities deals, and most recently reform areas for economic recovery and community wealth building, which is why we have him here today. He has a particular interest in better collaborative working between national, local and third sector agencies, and he's also a board member of Developing the Young Workforce Fife and a governor of Fife College. So Gordon, we're delighted to have you with us and delighted that you are kicking off our first speaking input. So over to you. And we do have your slides, I think, visible for everybody. So
great, thanks Liz, and a pleasure to be here and talk to colleagues. And I hope as I go through and explain where we are on the Fife journey, that this isn't things that people have heard before. So I just wanted to start off by quickly running through why Fife has particularly picked up the community wealth building agenda within the last 12 or 18 months. And it really started from our last local outcome improvement plan, our plan for Fife, when we carried that out in 2017 with a focus on opportunities for all thriving places, inclusive growth and jobs and community-led services. So although we weren't using the language of community wealth building at that time, there was very much an underlying intent that we would try and address some of the systemic issues in Fife, particularly in our areas of deprivation, through new and different approaches. That then led into our elected members visiting other places where community wealth building was being developed. So Wigan, Oldham, Preston. So lots of trips to Lancashire to look at what was happening there. I think there's an understanding amongst our elected members that Fife is not starting from a blank canvas, but this is very much about scale, pace and depth as part of our economic recovery, which is why we've linked economic recovery and community wealth building as part of our reform. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment or two. I think we also recognise over the last 12 months and what we've been working towards as part of our economic recovery is that those existing inequalities that existed in Fife have very much been amplified. So I don't know if people know the geography of Fife, but it's really a game of 3 halves. So we have relatively affluent communities in Dunfermline and South and West Fife, and again in North East Fife, but significant areas of disadvantage in what we call Mid Fife. So that's the area around Glenrothes, Cowdenbeath, Kirkcaldy and Levenmouth. And on the back of that, therefore, we moved quickly to develop a reform approach around community wealth building. And the first stage of that was supported by Scottish Government. We were able to engage with CLES to develop our action plan, and that's very much through the prism of the Tay Cities region. But as Liz mentioned in her introduction, Fife looks 2 ways. So we're part of the economic geography of Tay Cities, along with Dundee, Perth and Kinross and Angus, but also Edinburgh and South East Scotland, and I'll say a little bit about both as we go forward. That culminated in a Fife Report and Action Plan, which we've taken to our members for approval, but critically also has significant buy-in as we went through the kind of workshop process and working groups from all members of Fife Partnership, and again I'll come on to mention some by name as we go forward. And I think critically we've really reached out to stakeholders beyond the usual anchor institutions. So we're starting to see this with the support of the Chamber of Commerce, particularly with our major and smaller private sector businesses, who I see as absolutely essential to help us deliver, both in terms of being those suppliers on the ground, but also in turn using their supply chains to influence activity. So quickly, we run through a number of areas with our elected members, recognising they would all have different starting points and views on this. So these are the areas that we looked at. I won't go into all of this, but we tried to deal with each of the 5 pillars in a fairly structured way as we went forward. But community wealth building we see very much as the underpinning activity that supports all of our reform approaches, which will ultimately lead to the development of a new economic strategy and indeed a new local outcome improvement plan within the next 12 months. And these are the other reform areas. And I just wanted to bring this slide up to show that there's a very strong interaction. So from a policy perspective, anti-poverty, economic recovery, climate change, very much seen as our 3 priority areas. Place leadership, the model by which they're delivered, and that's all underpinned by a community wealth building approach, which has to run through the whole of the organisation as the council, but also across our partners. So just being a bit slow in moving forward here, so bear with me. So one of our early actions was to find out where we were in terms of local procurement. And this slide sets out the current position. So I think the headline figures for me are about 38% of our supply comes from organisations who are headquartered in Fife. That doesn't mean that those longer term contracts we have with others do not also generate local job and supply chain benefits, but that really gave us a marker of where we are and obviously a benchmark to increase upon. So knowing we're at 38%, you know, now the thinking is through our local procurement group, how do we move to 50%, how do we move to 60%, what capacity building do we need to put in place there? We're also very much connecting it to our work on becoming a living wage region, having had the UK's first living wage town in Glenrothes, and just some figures on the screen there, which again I won't go into for time, but we had a significant uplift as part of a very targeted campaign to pay the real living wage. You've probably seen this definition before. For community benefit clauses. How we're applying it in Fife is we're starting with some of the quick wins or quicker wins, so particularly working on our major capital schemes for construction with Hubco East, who are delivering new schools for us at Madras in Northeast Fife and the Dunfermline Learning Campus to come online within the next year, and how we really drive that community benefit forward, but seeing it not just as almost the hygiene factors of training, recruitment, job skills, supply chain, those should all be there. It's what happens beyond that. You know, what more community benefit can we derive both within Fife and through our regional working, because we're part of 2 regional initiatives and 2 economic action plans to move that forward. Just again, some figures to show some of the movement from where we were before we had a community benefits approach to 2019-20, and these figures continue to rise, and that's great. And some slightly different examples of community asset transfer, and again, we're focusing on property here today, so sorry, on procurement today, so I won't go into this in detail either, but part of the thinking here is really in terms of community benefit linked to community asset transfer. How do we shift mindsets from you know, a traditional value, traditional approach to best value, which says it's pounds and pence, to actually these are investments in our communities and help towards more self-sustaining activity. So quickly then on the CLES recommendations, and I realise I'm flying through this, but there will be a chance for questions. The relevant actions of the 20 or so that we've agreed to take forward as part of the CLES action plan. So firstly, to develop a community benefits framework and how we build on that. And that's very much about each of our 7 areas, developing proper propositions that can be brought forward as part of structured discussions on community benefits. To open up community benefits more widely, and that's certainly something that we'll be doing. Wider market engagement, so through the National Supplier Development Programme, about 10% of all businesses on that programme are 5 businesses, but we can do more, a lot more. And then look to influence others. So we've had a fantastic response from our other anchor institutions, NHS Fife College, the University of St Andrews, to name but a few, and all of our community planning partners are signed up to this, as I say. The other aspects, as Neil touched on, we have an action to further our CDFI model and work with our credit unions to build up the Kingdom banking approach, and that will be an important piece of work going forward. And then finally, a commitment to look to explore with pension funds what more we can deliver locally. So in terms of the next steps, and we're very much on a journey here, is to develop a partnership delivery approach, to use that community wealth building underpinning reform by training every single member of staff at Fife Council in what community wealth building means for them, both as a person and as an officer of the council, and working with our colleagues to do in anchor institutions to do likewise. And then to start to embed community wealth building and community benefits into our regional economic action plan for Tay cities, and to use tools at our disposal like the Senefit system for Edinburgh and South East Scotland. So it's been a really important and learning journey for us. We've got really good buy-in, and yeah, very exciting place to be. Happy to take any questions on it, Liz.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing questions so far in the chat box, and I do want to encourage people to either use the chat box or to use the raised hand. Can I just ask, does anybody have anything they want to ask of Gordon before we move on? Because I'm trying to try and keep this tight in terms of time today, because we've got quite a lot to fit in. So if there are no immediate questions, I just have one point, Gordon. You showed I think on the slide, I was peering at it a wee bit, but it looked as though it was a report with the CLES recommendations when you were talking about, you know, how you were kind of taking forward some of those community wealth building, you know, pillars, if you like. So is that available to everybody? I see it. Was it published in January? Was that right? Was I reading that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. And yes, we took it to our committee on March the 4th. So happy to share the link to that report, and people can see not only the CLES report, the report that goes with it, but how it sits within our wider reform landscape as well, which may be of assistance.
That's great. That would be really helpful, I think, to everybody here. Okay, so moving on swiftly, our next speaker is Callum Ian McIver, who is Community Directors with Western Isles Council. Callum Ian has a really truly extensive brief, I have to say, overseeing critical council functions including planning, housing, environmental health, trading standards, business gateway, community regeneration, economic development, libraries, museums, heritage, municipal services, cleansing services, public transport and assets and infrastructure, which actually, although that is, I can see an extensive mix, I can imagine that would be really actually very useful in the context of building all of those collaborative links that are required for community wealth building. So really keen to hear what you've got to say, Callum. You were previously Head of Economic Development for the Council, and you've also held previous roles with Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Skye and Calsh Enterprise, and Western Isles Enterprise. So really extensive experience there that we're looking to benefit from today. And I won't even go into all you've been doing in the community. That's even more. So over to you, Callum. We've got your slide on the screen now, and hopefully we can hear you as well.
Thank you very much, Liz, and good afternoon, colleagues. I thought it would be useful just to start off with just a very quick overview of the Outer Hebrides and Highland and Shire. Most of you will be aware of this, but I think it is useful just to run through it, just to identify the differences between an island community, a deeply rural community, and maybe some of the urban projects that are going on under community wealth benefits. So the Outer Hebrides are a chain of islands 130 miles long. People are sometimes surprised by the length of the Hebrides. If you superimpose them over a map of Scotland, they would run from Inverness in the north to the borders in the south. So a very long chain of islands. Population of around 27,000, but our population is declining and is projected to decline quite significantly over the next 20 years. We have quite a fragile economy based around the primary sectors, tourism and a growing life sciences sector, high cost of living, and quite an over-dependence on the public sector. All that said, there are real areas of opportunity, particularly around renewable energy, the green economy. We have a hugely dynamic community sector. So about 75% of all the people in the Outer Hebrides live on community-owned land that was bought from private landowners over the last 10 to 15 years. We have around 30 megawatts of community-owned wind generation. And we have about 500 small community-based organisations delivering a range of community services across the islands. We have a first-class natural environment, and in our Gaelic culture, we have a unique culture and heritage. Next slide, please. I think when we were looking at recovery from COVID last summer and beginning to put recovery plans in place, working with our partners at Highlands and Islands Enterprise, we were articulating quite a lot of issues around community wealth, although not community wealth as we're talking about here. Some of the key components were in what we were talking about. So we're talking about a recovery, building on localism, building on community capacity, resilience, and the prioritisation of local supply chains and local procurement. So there's a lot of stuff in our recovery plan around local market resilience, decentralisation of the public sector, creating food and other produce closer to the point of consumption, how we manage to utilise local quota, for example, for the fishing industry, how we develop greater resilience and capacity across our construction sector, how we use procurement in a more positive way, how we put innovation into affordable housing, and how we look at innovation around environmental designations. So not using the community wealth building 5 pillars, but very much articulating ideas around community wealth building themes. Next slide, please. We then obviously were identified in the programme for government as one of the 6 areas to work with the government to begin to build community wealth building plans. And then we obviously engaged with CLES, or CLES engaged with us in regard to how we go about that. Now, I'd like to thank Neil and his team for the support they have provided to us over the past period. So Neil and the team have been very much engaging with the council, with the community planning partnership, and a range of bodies out in the community, leading to a draft action plan. So we're just working through with Neil at the moment on the elements of that plan and what is absolutely critical for us to take forward. So the plan at the moment, and hopefully it will keep, 22 actions. So just to quickly run through what some of these actions look like. So we definitely believe there is a need for an element of culture change within the Corner, within the council, and within our partners in the community planning partnership. So the next period, I think, is going to be a period of that culture change, of deepening the understanding of community wealth building, both within our own council and with other organisations. Beyond that, we want to have quite a sharp focus on procurement and develop a set of additional procurement strategies. I think Neil touched on it earlier, and I think our procurement team in the council are very much, as described by Neil, they're highly professional, highly au fait with the legislation, and will deliver procurement in a highly technically proficient and professional manner. But are they looking at it in a broad enough sense to capture all that we would want to capture under community wealth building? I'm sure if they were here themselves, they would say that there is greater opportunity for them to look at these things. So over the next period, we want to be doing market supply analysis. We want economic development to become more engaged with the procurement team. So as procurement is done, they are picking up all these elements of economic development. I think we have a form of benefits, community benefits framework in place, but I think there is a lot more that can be done with that to make it better, to make it more robust, and to deliver a lot more for us. And similarly, we have a lot of suppliers in the local economy who are doing a form of community benefit at the moment and will supply different types of small-scale community benefit. But I think engagement with these suppliers and these firms and these businesses will help them to be more understanding and to deliver even greater. So a lot of material in the action plan around procurement strategies and how we deliver that. Also in there is engagement with the Crofters Commission and land trusts. As I mentioned earlier, a significant amount of the population lives on community land, and a lot of that land is under crofting legislation. And crofting legislation, for those who are aware of it, is possibly the most challenging, confusing and multi-layered sets of legislation that you've probably ever come across. We're keen to engage with the Commission to find ways of simplifying that, to work with the land trusts to help them achieve more on their own land. So I think there is a work package in there that's ripe for further exploration and ripe for further work. And part of that is accelerating land need assessment processes. We have a lot of land, and we have a lot of land that looks as if it's available for development of different types. But when you explore into it, the land isn't credible for either housing or business development, or the type of land that has been released isn't credible for development purposes. So we want to work with the community to free up land, both to create a new revenue stream for themselves and to make it easier for business and housing development. In the Western Isles as well, we're impacted by a lot of organisations who have no real presence in the Outer Hebrides. A classic or a good example of that may be Marine Scotland. About 25% of all Scottish waters are in the Outer Hebrides marine area, but Marine Scotland has no presence in the Outer Hebrides. Their presence is in Edinburgh. So why an organisation whose key concern is the marine environment is in a city, I think is an interesting question. So we're keen to explore with government and a range of other public organisations what the opportunities are to begin to relocate jobs to areas under severe population pressure, such as the Outer Hebrides. Next slide, please. I also mentioned at the outset the real opportunity around renewable energy and green jobs, particularly nature-based jobs. About 80% of the Outer Hebrides landmass and a significant level of the waters around us are under environmental designation of one sort or another, be it marine protected areas, special areas of conservation, triple SIs, a significant amount of designation. But that designation offers opportunity around nature-based jobs. So we're keen on these ideas of green jobs, both in regard to renewable energy, the generation of energy, and to use the environment to create nature-based jobs. I mentioned population loss at the beginning, and one of the ideas we are exploring around, along with colleagues in North Ayrshire, Argyll and Bute, and parts of Highland Council, is this idea of beginning to develop a repopulation zone in areas of acutest population challenge. So we presented a paper at the Convention of the Highlands and Islands on Monday, which the Convention were highly supportive of and have encouraged us to move into the next stage of development of that concept. So we will be working over the next period to develop that, and it's interesting that it has been picked up as a concept that has real relevance to community benefit, to community wealth building. And similarly, we want to develop a good employer charter. We do have a range of firms and businesses in the islands who already are doing a lot in this regard, but we think more can be done working closer with the businesses. We also have a range of businesses who are very cooperative with the community in the way we work, but we think there are other businesses who could do a lot more in this area with an appropriate level of assistance and support to them. So we want to explore how we can convert some of these businesses into a more cooperative stance. So these are some of the key themes coming out of the draft action plan at the moment. So over the next couple of weeks, we will be working with Neil and team to finalise the draft plan to a final plan. For us, we've got to do a wee bit of work around ensuring appropriate prioritisation, that the themes within the plan, that we have them organised in such a way to deliver the most impact and the most benefit at the earliest opportunity. We obviously have to steer it through our various council committees and through the community planning partnership process. We believe that they are well bought into that process already, so that is, I would hope, just a technical exercise to allow that to be ticked off. And then, of course, the critical part of it, working with the council as anchor institutions, working with the other anchor institutions in the community planning partnership, and working with the broader economy and the broader community to deliver on the elements in there. So very much looking forward to finalising the plan, getting it formally approved through the council, working on these culture change elements in the council, and delivering a set of new benefits for the economy and the wider community. Happy to leave it there, but happy to try to answer any questions as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Callum. That was really excellent. A really good run through and summation of where you are so far, and also the kind of, I suppose, the specific and unique challenges and opportunities that living in that kind of rural island community brings, and across that really quite extensive. Really interesting when you talked about the length and the size of the geography. I don't think we always appreciate that. And that's a factor too. Thought it was really interesting as well what you said about culture change and the need for that, and both in terms of internal departments and in the council, namely procurement, as you mentioned. But I think there's something about the way that's come up frequently in these sessions we've been running about, if you're working in partnership and working collaboratively, actually that requires a different type of working, a different way of working. So there's something about how we generate some of that, and certainly EDAS really keen to explore some of that and some of the learning that we take forward beyond this point. I am not seeing, again, people are being quite quiet today. I think hopefully they're quite rapt with the quality of the presentations, but I'm not seeing any immediate questions. We do have time further in the agenda to look at a discussion and questions around the content so far. So without further ado, because I'm mindful of time, I think we're likely to run over into the next hour, but that's okay. We can accommodate that. I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, who is Val McNeice, who's on secondment as Programme Manager for Health and Inclusive Growth at NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Glasgow City Council. Now, Val's an experienced public health professional with a background in research and evaluation, generating insights and evidence for better and more equal health. She has strong project management and communication skills, using evidence to influence policy decision-making based on an in-depth knowledge of public health policy and practices in Glasgow and across Scotland. Her particular interests are in inequality, inclusion, the economy, children and families, social value, and participatory approaches, all of which you can imagine are really relevant to this agenda. And she previously held various NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde roles for the Centre for Population Health, which obviously has a very strong reputation in this country. So over to you, Val, for your input. I'm not sure if you have slides that we need to put on the screen here.
No, no slides.
That's okay. Okay, so over to you.
So yeah, thanks, Liz. Just to say thanks very much to EDAS for these sessions to begin with. I found them really useful. So if anyone's on the call that hasn't been at some of the other sessions, I think it'd be really worthwhile going back and checking out the other conversations that we've had. So yeah, as Liz mentioned, in Glasgow we have this joint public health and economic development post, and that's been in place for over a year now. And that's me, and I come from the GCPH, the Glasgow Centre for Population Health, but I'm now based in the city region team at Glasgow City Council. The joint work, I think, came originally from a recognition that we've got a particular issue in Glasgow with income and health inequality, and so we're seeing too many people who would like to be engaged in the paid economy not being able to do that for various reasons, and so they're not getting those health and economic benefits that comes from participation in creating wealth, but also benefiting from the wealth that's created in the area. And we recognise that there's a mutual relationship there between a population in good health and well-being and a strong and inclusive economy, importantly. So we're trying to work on both of those areas together. And we've done some, the City Council have previously done some inclusive growth diagnostic work with the Scottish Government, which is where this programme originated. So obviously the Glasgow City region is huge, a bit different from the geography that was in the previous presentation. There's eight member authorities, including Glasgow City itself, and we take a regional approach to economic development, but also have activity focused on Glasgow City. In terms of the community wealth building approach, we had been discussing community wealth building a bit before the pandemic. We had a series of workshops looking at action areas that public health and economic development could work on together, and community wealth building came out of some of that. But it's now really well embedded, I would say, in our plans for recovery, renewal and reform, and that's at both the city level and at the city region level. And we've been working with Scottish Government and CLES, thanks to Neil and Geraldine and Rachel, to look at how we can progress community wealth building across the city region. And just in the last couple of weeks, we now have two papers that have been approved by regional partnership, ready to take into action. So we're at a reasonably early stage of this work. And Neil mentioned earlier in his presentation that we agreed to focus on 2 of the 5 pillars initially, with a view to picking up the other 3 as we go on. We don't want to miss out on those. We do want to take a full community wealth building approach, but we're focusing initially on progressive procurement, and we're paying particular attention there to the construction sector and on the pillar of socially just use of land and property. And the focus there is on vacant and derelict land specifically, mostly because vacant and derelict land sites across the region are numerous and have posed social and economic issues for many years that we haven't quite been able to solve. There's existing good practice in both of these areas. Some of this is associated with the city deal work in the city region, and we really want to build on that progress that's already been made and those relationships that are already there. The community wealth building work that exists at the moment, I would say, is on the margins, and we really want to bring this into the mainstream. So we want to get the foundations right and shift sort of the way we do things around here so it becomes standard practice. So our next steps are reviewing the recommendations from those reports in terms of the 2 pillars and translating that into action. So what's practical and achievable? How will we do that? Who should be involved? And crucially, taking the steps to deliver on what we set out. So I think there are some really great examples of community wealth building across the region already. But we now can be doing much better in terms of that collaborative work across anchor organisations that others have mentioned in terms of a shared mission. We're keen to bring together a community wealth building community of practice for the region. So we've begun some of that. We want to tap into where there's good work and enthusiasm for work that supports community wealth building. And I'm working with some of the regional partners just now to try and take a snapshot, I suppose, of where each of the member authorities are in terms of their own community wealth building work and what their plans are, so we can be marrying that up across the region. So that collective action is going to be really important for us across the big city region. Someone has just last week been appointed into a new joint post that's been created to work between Public Health Scotland and Economic Development for the region. So that's great too. We're building a bit more momentum there. And then I'll also be pulling together some recommendations relating to the other 3 pillars of community wealth building work that we haven't looked so closely at yet. So plural ownership, making financial power work, and the fair employment and just labour markets pillars. And again, we'll be working with the member authorities on those, starting with what already exists. And there's also, I think, lots of great learning from other cities and regions that we can incorporate into that. Just to mention, I think that we're also really mindful of making this the shift to community wealth building changes how we define and measure economic success for the region, and that's a big deal, I think. So we need to be able to capture more sustainable, shared types of prosperity. And we have the intelligence hub for the city region, so we're in a good place to be able to do that. And I think working jointly, there's a good recognition there that economic determinants of population health are huge, and so we need indicators that will help us to look at more of a well-being economy type approach. And I think just one more point from me that this work, for me anyway, has really highlighted that the kind of traditional ways that we organise finance and budgeting, funding streams, can really kind of encourage us to work separately from each other, and that comes with a whole set of difficulties. And also that there's a real ease in describing the problem compared to the sort of complexity of enacting some of the solutions to these issues. And it's kind of an easy trap to fall into, to continue to describe our different problems, but we're really keen, we're trying to get into that sort of solution space and that action focused space. So I think the will's really there, especially at the moment, to make some of these big system changes that we need to make to do some of this stuff. So I probably haven't provided a great deal of detail about our recommendations and the action that we're going to do. We're just at the stage of fleshing out, but I'm happy to hear from anyone now or after this session if there's anything that would be of interest to discuss a bit further. Thanks, Liz. Thanks very much, Val. That was really interesting. And I think probably having worked for pretty much all of my career in Glasgow or the surrounding areas, I do not underestimate the challenge and the task that lies ahead in terms of the scale of deprivation, poverty, the challenges that exist in that area, in that region, but also the opportunities because of the mass of agencies, third sector, social enterprise, the kind of organisations and bodies, anchor organisations as well, in housing, etc., that have a contribution to play there. So I think it's potentially really exciting, but not surprising that you've kind of concentrated on 2 because of those layers of complexity as well. So it'll be really interesting to hear how that progresses over time. I should have also asked both you and Callum, just before you finished up there, you've clearly got, you've worked with CLES, you've got the recommendations available. Is that something that can be shared, or do we need to wait until that's been reviewed before that can be shared with our audience and our members here at EDAS? Yeah, I'm happy to share the two papers that we've got just now, and yeah, we're just sort of translating those, and there'll be action plans to follow. But yeah, that's fine. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Val. Callum, would you be able to do the same?
Yeah, we'll just when we've reached the point where we've signed off with Neil, yeah, we'll be happy to share at that point. Okay, excellent, excellent. Okay, so moving on swiftly, our final speaker today is Julie McLachlan, who's Senior Manager in Economic Policy with North Ayrshire Council.
Julie leads the North Ayrshire Council's approach to inclusive economic policy. She's playing a pivotal role in developing and delivering Scotland's first approach to community wealth building, which of course I think we're all now really well aware you are at the forefront of all of this, Julie. And she led the development of North Ayrshire's community wealth building strategy and authored the Council's economic recovery and renewal approach, which sets out a local Green New Deal for North Ayrshire. She was part of the team responsible for the award-winning North Ayrshire Inclusive Growth Diagnostic, undertaken in partnership with the Scottish Government's Office of the Chief Economic Advisor. And she also acts as Secretariat to Ayrshire Community Wealth Building Commission. So a wealth of experience and knowledge there, Julie, which we're very much looking forward to in terms of your reflections on our theme today. So over to you.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks to EDAS for the invitation to speak to you today about our work on community wealth building. It really is a pleasure for me to be part of this panel of speakers of whom I've discussed community wealth building with over the past few years. So, and it's great to see also a diversity of regions as well. And I think that issue about scale is really important in relation to community wealth building, the different types of approaches that you can implement at different geographical levels. So we launched our community wealth building strategy in May 2020. We see community wealth building as being about embedding a new economic model, one that's focused on well-being and inclusion. It's clear that traditional approaches to economic development have not worked for places like North Ayrshire, and the Scottish Government recently identified North Ayrshire as being the least resilient economy in Scotland. So it's clear we need to do things differently, and for us, community wealth building is the answer. So our strategy sets out a community wealth building mission, which is about enhancing local wealth, the creation of fair jobs, and maximising the potential of all the places in North Ayrshire through working in partnership with our communities and business. And I think that final aspect of the mission there is really important. This is about working in partnership. No one sector can do community wealth building. You know, it can be led and there can be stewardship from the public sector. I think you have to also take into account the bottom-up approaches that comes through community-led activity and also business-led activity as well. And it has to all work together to be a supportive and thriving environment for community wealth building. So our strategy is very action oriented. There's 55 actions there. You'll be glad to hear I'm not going to run through each of those this afternoon. And there's 6 key community wealth building objectives that we are striving to create a fairer local and regional economy through delivery of those. The first one of those, and it's been mentioned today, is about culture change really. It's about us becoming a community wealth building council and working across all of our services, so not just economic development, not just procurement, but working across all of our services and our wider local and regional partners to implement this first approach to community wealth building. Procurement, so we want to use our local spend to actively encourage and support a diverse and resilient business base, but also to support our net zero carbon ambitions as well. And I think there's a lot of work starting to emerge about the link between the wellbeing economy and environment. There's work that Claes and others have done in the past on things like Green New Deal, which really can take a community wealth building approach to tackling the climate emergency that we all face. Fair employment, so that's about encouraging the creation of fair and meaningful jobs with progression opportunities to unlock the potential of our residents. Land and assets, we aim to support the wider regeneration of our communities through maximising the land and assets that we own as a local authority and looking at alternative uses for community and business benefit. Financial power, and that's about us investing locally, investing at a community level, giving some control over to our communities to look at how they want to invest the funds and develop their own proposals around that through things like participatory budgeting, community investment funds, and also looking at more progressive forms of financial power, supporting our credit union, looking at pension funds, looking at the feasibility of a West of Scotland community bank. And the final area is around plural ownership, and we aim to support the creation and sustainability of a range of business models. So locally owned SMEs, social enterprises, employee ownership, cooperatives, community enterprises, and also municipalisation and municipal activity. So there's a range of actions in there. I'll maybe just highlight a few of those. Encouraging local businesses to explore more local supply chains as well. So we can look at our own supply chains as a council, but also encourage local businesses to do the same. Reviewing our land and assets and exploring commercial opportunities to grow local wealth, develop local energy schemes. We've currently agreed a solar farm proposal on a former landfill site that will be delivered through community wealth building, and promoting the cooperative model and employee ownership transition. In North Ayrshire, we have quite a large family business base, and we want to ensure the sustainability of that through an employee ownership approach. To support the delivery of our strategy, we've created 9 new roles. We've also established a community wealth building expert advisory panel, which Neil is on and is chaired by the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. I would just like to briefly highlight 2 of the roles that we've created, given some of the focus is on procurement today. We've created the role of a procurement development manager, and really their purpose is to bridge a gap between procurement and economic development, to explore procurement opportunities for local businesses, understand the capacity of the local business base, and promote and deliver specific supplier development opportunities for the local business base. And a community benefits officer as well, who's reviewing our approach to community benefits, which was a specific action within our strategy, learning from best practice from across Scotland and looking at different approaches that we can take to community benefits, including wish lists, where communities and localities have more of a say on the things that come out of community benefits. And also looking to ensure that not just around the council's community benefits, but for other projects delivered in our area, how do we ensure that there are community benefits that make sense to North Ayrshire and make sense to our communities and local businesses? We also have a Community Wealth Building Commission, which we established in 2019, and we've now extended that to the whole of the Ayrshire region. And that will support the delivery of the Ayrshire Growth Deal's £3 million Community Wealth Building Funds. I'd be happy to see more of this as we work through the discussion. The Commission has now agreed a work plan as well, which we will focus on, and work in procurement has already commenced. And I guess one key success story was the launch of our Community Wealth Building Anchor Charter in October during Challenge Poverty Week. And this has been signed by 6 major anchor institutions, including the NHS, College, Scottish Enterprise, the 3 councils, and the third sector interface. So again, the role of anchor institutions, anchor collaboration is key. We're shortly about to start working on our annual report, given that this is nearly a year since the launch of our strategy. And I see this as a really good opportunity to highlight some of the practice, highlight the different ways of working that we've embedded because of community wealth building. There's a real risk that this becomes just another buzzword. And actually, community wealth building is really about practice and practical action that we can take to deliver economic change and to deliver social, economic and environmental justice. So I'll leave it there. It's a real snapshot of our journey so far, and I'm happy to pick up any questions.
Oh, thanks so much, Julie. That was excellent. Really clear, but really concise whistle-stop tour of all that's been happening in North Ayrshire, which I think everybody, I'm sure, on this call and in this room has been watching very closely, because you are very much kind of the trailblazers in the forefront of this across Scotland. So excellent contributions from everyone. We haven't, as far as I can see, we've just got commentary going on in the chat box just now. So we'll leave questions. Could I ask you though to be pondering some questions? If we just take a very short 5-minute break, is that okay, Neil? Just very short 5-minute break and come back at 3:20, just so we can pick up then on the remainder of the agenda around some questions and discussion and looking at where we go from here. Okay, so see you in 5 minutes, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Liz. I'm going to have to leave now, but hopefully, if there's any questions, happy to follow up offline.
Of course. No, thanks very much for taking time out. I know everyone's really busy trying to condense everything into their day, their working days. So really appreciate it, Gordon.
No problem.
Thanks, Gordon.
He does as well, yeah.
Nice to see you.
And you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Oops. Okay, Elaine?
Yeah, I'm fine. How are you? I can't really speak privately, so.
No, I'm just going to go and reheat to my tea or get a fresh tea.
Me too.
We're back
See
in
you
2 minutes. Yeah, okay.
Great presentations, aren't they? They're fantastic. Well done, Julie. Can't hear you, Liz.
Sorry, I'm muted. I was saying, I think, yeah, I agree. All of the sessions, actually, the speaker input's been fantastic.
That'd be great, aye. They've been good. It's all in the briefing, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so do you think I don't know, Elaine, Alison, I can't see who's returned and how many we have. We're ready to start again?
I'd say so. That's 20 past.
Okay, good. Now, Neil, I'm passing over to you for this part of the agenda, which is really on the kind of, well, we can do it together, but the kind of questions and answer and discussion following the inputs. think we might have to ask you to pick on a few people.
Aye, it's no like them, isn't it? I mean,
It's really unusual.
We've got a lot of new people. I think they're going to come on now, aren't they? We'll do a bit of a double header here, Liz. I'm going to kick it off though with a question here. So everybody, come on now, folks. Get your questions in. Put your hands up, and we'll get you speaking. I've got two questions. What will I ask? I'll leave one to the end. The last question I'm going to ask you, which I'm going to tell you now, you don't have to answer it now, is what would be a key ask of Scottish Government to accelerate the community wealth building agenda in your place? That's what I want to finish on. But this question is what I want to ask you now. What aspect in your area would you say is the key systemic change point around community wealth building? What would be the biggie you're thinking? If we get that right, that's really going to cook the mustard. What's the word I'm looking for? That's really going to what's the word I'm looking for when something hits the nail on the head? Aye, that's it. What would be a key aspect that really hits the nail on the head in terms of systemic change around community wealth building in your place? If we could really get it to go and have some of those actions. Could I start with? I'm going to start with Julie because you've probably a little bit ahead of this and probably thought about this before. What's the key one for you, Julie?
I think it's that issue about resilience, Neil. And I think for too long we've been overly relying on this traditional approach and inward investment. And I'm not saying inward investment is a bad thing, because I think if it aligns to community wealth building, fair work, net zero, it can be a positive thing for local places. But I think for too long we've relied on that. We've relied on huge capital projects, and we haven't actually realised what's in our local business space and what's in our communities and what assets we already have that we could maximise and use and develop, and therefore that would create a more resilient economy where local communities, local businesses had more control over the direction of the economy. So I think I could go on a bit about that, but for me it's really that switching of that mindset, realising what we already have and where do we grow that, and then the focus on resilience in light of all the problems that we face, rather than just a single focus on economic growth.
Oh, Neil, you're muted.
Oh, for goodness sake, get it together, Neil. I think you're right, Julie. That's spot on. And actually, we had a conversation today with Scottish Enterprise, of colleagues from Scottish Enterprise, very much about how the systemic bit is around how we think about economic development and the pathways that we've traditionally used, and those pathways maybe a little bit in the groove and a little bit worn, a little bit tired, and the pathways are not taking us to a land of social, economic and ecological justice. So I think that's, and I see Susan's agreeing from FSB there, FSB Scotland agreeing in the chat, which I might want to bring her in actually at some point. So I'll bring you in maybe at some point, Susan. So get ready. Val, same question to you. A key aspect you think would bring the systemic? You can't repeat what Julie said because I'm sure you would agree. So don't go cop out. You've got to say something different. It's going to be hard for Callum Ian. A key point about systemic change for you. What would be the key thing that would happen in Glasgow City? You go, aha, now we're cracked.
I think shared spending would be great. So, I think we can see that there's barriers with different pots of money that are set aside for various bits of activity. And if only we could have a longer term approach with those, or join them up with other bits of funding across the local authority, but also potentially with some other anchor organisations, and we could work collaboratively with shared funds, that would make a massive difference. And we're starting to look at that a bit, looking at a regional investment fund that we could share, and actually someone's working on an options paper for that just now, and I think that would be a massive systemic change if we could do that, to take the power of that money and bring that together.
Well said. And you would agree with Julie, wouldn't you?
Of course I would, yeah.
I think you're spot on there, and I think if Gordon was here, I think, and maybe other areas as well, the health board, bits of its procurement spend linked to the local authority, linked to the college, or university. There's possibilities there, isn't there? I think maybe not the whole scale one public estate pooling of spending, but in down certain areas, I think that's a definitely way to go. Callum, Ian, same question to you. What would you think would be the big systemic change point vis-a-vis community wealth building for the Western Isles? Oh, you're on mute, Callum.
There is something in the untapped potential of communities that we're not quite getting to as yet. So I think there is a piece of work around community empowerment and community governance. I think we need to devolve more power and more responsibility down out of institutions closer to the community, to give communities who live in a local place, to give the businesses who work and earn their living in these places the opportunity to do more themselves for their own communities. I think if we empowered some of our places a bit more, they would come up with more interesting ideas and more powerful ideas sometimes than some of the public sector ideas that come forward. So these ideas of empowerment and local governments, governance, I think are important.
No, I think that's a good one too, and I think that's the key conceptual elements of community wealth building, that economic democracy, and I think that giving power to communities to, in part, decide their own destiny. There's been a little bit of a paternalism in Scotland, let's be honest, isn't there?
I think there are some good examples though, Neil, and again, I've probably said this many times in these sessions, but if we look to the work of community-based, community-controlled housing associations and local anchors, there are some fantastic examples where the people that are living in those communities actually really direct investment so that it benefits the people that live there, whether that's in employment terms or investment in facilities that they're looking to develop, etc., or taking ownership of facilities that had previously been owned by the public sector. So maybe we need to make a bit more of that. Maybe as a progression, perhaps for some of this, we might visit some of that.
Really. I think there's a trick in amplifying it, isn't there, Liz? I think there's a lot of good stuff, but I think community wealth building, through its linking to economic development, is an opportunity to kind of more hot wire this and make it more seen as what economic development's about.
Yes.
Just the fluffy bit, if you get
me. Yeah. It kind of, because even the examples I'm describing, sometimes they can kind of sit in isolation, and they're not connecting in with what's happening, perhaps in these wider strategies that are being developed. I'm noticing on the chat that we actually do have some questions.
Ooh.
So Nikki from Clyde Gateway has been quite vocal here. So I know you've got a couple here, Nikki. So the first one is you were talking about Val and having the right measures of success and indicators is important. But who defines that success? There's a lot of data out there. How do we make sure it's usable and comparable across areas? So any thoughts on that particular question from any of our contributors?
Can I maybe give an example?
Are you there, Nikki?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. Fine, Nikki.
Yep.
Yeah, so the example on that, just taking it from the health point of view, we know that some of the measures around about healthy life expectancy are put out there, and from that you can look at productivity or quality of life in terms of an approach to communities as well. But how usable is that for co-production, working with communities, working collaboratively with partners to address some of the issues that we have? So maybe more usable indicators and data around about burden of disease helps us more, because we can look at years life lost, years lived with disability, and collectively with our communities we can start to look at some of the issues that are holding back areas, so that people can become more highly skilled, people can start to experience some of the great assets that we've got, whether that's new parks, etc. Because sometimes what we see is a slide, particularly relevant in Clyde Gateway, we see a slide that's got the train stations from Jordan Hill through to Bridgeton in the East End of Glasgow, and 14 years life lost if you live in Jordan Hill, if you live in Bridgeton. But what doesn't follow that slide up is what we're doing about that next. And some of the detail underneath that is about using the key indicators that can maybe look at things like worklessness. So from that point of view in terms of linking in the health agenda. So how do we look at reducing worklessness when it looks at conditions, burdens of disease? How do we measure that? And how do we then translate that across different areas? So that's where I was maybe coming from. That's very specific to health. But I think there's a plethora of indicators out there. It's getting the right ones that can measure progress. So that was kind of the example just on that specific question, Liz.
Is there something in the mix there about the different agencies? Because Neil, you said at the beginning with your diagram, when you showed police and you showed housing and you showed the various public agencies that are in the mix now, all of those agencies collect massive amounts of data, and it's how does that get shared and understood and interpreted to mutual benefit?
I think just taking all that, really, I think there's a general question about sharing the data, but I think there's an important question for our colleagues here just about whether we've got a lot of stuff going about. I mean, the National Performance Framework, there's well-being and inclusive growth diagnosis, there's all, I would like to hear their views on whether they think there is a proper set of indicators at a local level that can drive performance, and if that's neat enough as regards community wealth building. Thoughts on that? And I know Julie's working on this in North Ayrshire, so I'll come with you first, Julie, on that, but there's others as well, just in terms of, do you think we've got something that's fit for purpose in driving through a more economic, social and ecologically just Scotland under the auspice of community wealth building? Do we have it right here, Julie? What do you think?
I think we've got a baseline, Neil, but I think there are gaps. We're looking just now at developing an inclusive economy dashboard, which learns from the donut economics model developed by Kate Rayworth. And really the reason why we're looking at that is I think I alluded to it in my presentation, that we can no longer look at the economy and the environment as separate things that do not interact with each other. If we're thinking about green economic recovery, we have to look at them as two sides of the same coin and not competing elements. So we're looking at bringing together economic data and environmental data, but also this thinking around a socio-economic foundation as well. At a local level, we have a real issue with reliable local economic data. I think when it comes to measuring community wealth building specifically, we don't have a good set of local indicators. We have council performance indicators or anchor performance indicators around our local spend, but we don't really have a plethora or a basket of indicators that we can draw from. And that was one of the issues that I did come into when we were developing the North Ayrshire strategy, was that there are certain outcomes we can relate community wealth building back to, like child poverty, employment, vacant and derelict land, bigger picture indicators. But actually how you get to that, there's a bit of a missing of the data. I have to say though, I do sometimes struggle with the over-fixation on data, because I think it prevents action. I think we can focus too much on gathering things, but actually not really looking at what we actually want to achieve once we have that data. What I would also say as well is that there's data at a local authority level, but sometimes that doesn't make sense for someone living in Ardrossan or living on Arran. So I think where we can get in a more kind of bottom-up approach. So we've got locality partnerships in North Ayrshire. They have their own locality plans based on indicators at their local level and qualitative feedback as well around what the issues are at their local level. But I think I do worry sometimes about the fixation with data. However, at the same time, we have to show how we've achieved success. I think case studies of practical action are a good way to show that, as well as a focus on quantitative figures.
Yes, thanks, Julie. Anything from Callum or Val on this? Callum is moving towards the mute button. So sorry, Val. I'll give you a name.
Oh, sorry, Callum. Do you want to speak?
No, on you go, Val, and I'll come in after you.
I was just going to say I completely agree with what Julie said, and that we have absolutely masses of information, statistical information, and we absolutely don't need to be measuring more. But we do need to think very carefully about what we place most emphasis on, because I think sometimes the things that are easiest to measure are not actually what's most important. But if we give that the kudos, then it becomes the most important thing. It seems like it's the most important thing to us, and that's dangerous. And it's back to that again. It's absolutely so much easier to describe a set of problems than it is to spend your time working on the solutions to those problems. So we need to avoid that too. And I absolutely agree that we need statistical data, but also the stories that go along with it. So the numbers can only tell us so much, and so can the stories, and we need a combination of both of those things to look at change over time.
Spot on. Yeah, immediacy bias, isn't it? You know, what's immediate, what's right in front of you, you're biased towards. But nice one, Val. Calmeen.
I should have actually gone before Val, because she said exactly what I was going to say. But what I would say is that we do spend an inordinate amount of time, you know, collecting data, analysing data, reporting data, moving figures from one place to another, and half the time you're doing that, it would be more productive actually doing real work. So looking at our plan, Neil, I was giving some thought the other day to how you put a measurement framework around it that actually makes sense. And I began to fall myself into the trap of going, well, I think I could measure that easily, so let's just put that in because I could count that quickly. But it needs something a lot more sophisticated, a lot more thoughtful than that, and something that makes sense to the community we're serving. If the community isn't able to understand, you know, the data you're collecting and the reason you're collecting it and why it's of value to them, in a way, you're probably collecting the wrong data. So I think we've got to be really thoughtful about this and ensure that what we are doing has relevance.
Okay.
Nice.
I'm conscious we have got a number of other questions here. I know, Nikki, you've put another question in, but if you don't mind, I'll skip over it just because I'd like to get some other contributions as well. But if we have time, we'll come back to it. We've got Laura Worku, who's asking the panelists, and to any of you in terms of your localities, what are the biggest obstacles to the kind of culture change needed to implement community wealth building in your areas? So I don't know who wants to go first on that one. Maybe we do it in reverse order. Callum Ian.
At the risk of saying something dangerous here, I would say leadership. You know, if we don't have the people at the top of organisations, at the top of councils, community planning partnerships, and other organisational and anchor institutions, seeing the benefit of this, willing to lead on this, and pushing this down and embedding this in their organisations, we're always going to be a wee bit stuck. So I would hope that, you know, one of the first key bits of work we'll be doing, and I mentioned at the beginning about this idea of culture change, and I do believe our leadership is bought in, but sometimes saying you're bought in and actually demonstrating that are sometimes two different things. So I think that leadership element is absolutely critical for us embedding this and making real progress on this.
Okay, Julie, I seem to have lost, so maybe it's just my screen. I seem to have lost you, Val. I would have gone to you next. Oh, there you go. I think you're on mute. Yep.
I'm back. Sorry, a child needed help taking their shoes off, so I thought we'd spare us all from witnessing that drama. Biggest obstacle, culture change is really difficult. That's maybe the most obvious thing to say, but I mean, it really is. And I think in local authorities, there seems to me to be quite a hierarchical structure sometimes. And so it's quite difficult to find the space and the time for kind of reflection and to be allowed to do something that might result in making a mistake or yeah, to just kind of have that freedom to try out something a bit different, and there's the kind of cycle of reporting into various different committees and groups, and that kind of, I think that can take up a lot of time sometimes, and detracts from time that could be spent I don't know, I suppose doing something a bit more experimental and being allowed to fail a little bit of that in order to learn. So it's cultural change for me. And I certainly don't know the answer to that massive question.
Okay. I mean, I suppose reflecting on what you said, Callum, and also what you've just said, Val, you know, in terms of leadership and culture change, is there something about having some kind of deliberate, thought through program instigated as part of this around how to adapt and how to bring about culture change in some of these anchor organisations? Is that something that has ever been talked about or considered? You know, I'm conscious that, you know, my old previous roles, I've been involved in, you know, major kind of change transition programs where you've actually had to have a program around culture change with partners included as part of the mainstream work that you're trying to achieve, if that makes sense. So I don't know if there's any kind of thought on that. Sorry, Julia, we'll come to you in just a sec, but is that part of any of the work that you're doing, or is it just assumed that by having, you know, good leadership, culture change will happen?
I think we've got to go about it in a very thoughtful, methodical, proactive manner. It won't happen if you just say, oh, we're just going to change our culture, and therefore the culture changes. So if we don't go about it in that methodical, well thought out manner, then it's not going to happen. So definitely we have right at the top of our draft action plan some of these ideas about culture change. So we're going to have to give a wee bit of thought about it, whether we run that internally ourselves, or is there some methodology where we bring in a level of external support to help with that, particularly if it's across the entirety of the community planning partnership. So within the council, I've got a relatively good idea of how that is achievable and how that can be embedded. But then when you go out into the NHS, which has, you know, its own culture, and when you go into other elements of the community planning partnership, all of which have their own slightly different culture, having a joint framework and a joint approach may be the most, obviously possibly the best route to achieving on that. Okay.
Val, do you have any thoughts on that?
Just to say, I absolutely agree with that idea of having some external help with that. And there are processes that are well established, like doing a piece of action research, for example, that, you know, can look at how decision making happens, or look at some processes with someone who's not embedded in the organisation. I think can be a really useful exercise. And yeah, we're hoping to do something like that with some outside help. So, but I think more work. I would say this because I'm in one of them, but more of these joint posts I think are a good thing as well, because we're sort of marrying up these cultures from different organisations, and the more that you kind of work in a real collaborative way with different organisations, that the more kind of influence there is in terms of different ways of doing things.
Okay, I mean, I know certainly in other programmes I've been involved with, I think I mentioned before, and some of this reshaping care for older people, that, you know, there have been external academic expertise in the field of co-production and co-design that have been brought into work with partnerships, so that's about how you work differently in a partnership context, and also bringing in HR expertise from within those key agencies. So there's maybe, I know actually HR hasn't actually been sort of mentioned in terms of this, but I do wonder if it's got a role, you know, given that, you know, each anchor organisation will have an investment in that. Julie, your thoughts on this?
One of our strategies, one of our actions and the strategy is specifically around staff training. We have done a bit of that in the past. Neil came to one of our staff leadership conferences, and I think that point about having someone external is helpful, because Neil could potentially say things that maybe I wouldn't say to a counterpart. I probably would, but probably wouldn't do the next thing I emailed and that ask it to do for me by close of play or whatever. But I think having a different perspective is important. We do plan to do more staff training. We also have done elected member training. I think that's equally important. What we've also done though is built community wealth building into our decision making process. So any reports going through our executive leadership team or cabinet or councils all have to state how they are contributing to community wealth building. And in an ideal scenario, they relate that to the pillars and the actions within the strategy. So I think that's important. And by nature, if you are taking a big proposal forward, you need to get yourself familiar with community wealth building, how your project aligns with that, because it will be scrutinised. But I think investment in staff training is really important, and actually for them to not be just told what community wealth building is and what they should be doing, but for them to think themselves about what their role is in delivering community wealth building, I think is key.
Okay. Neil, I'm mindful here of time, and we've got a couple more questions in the chat box. Do you want to take them, or do we, because we're kind of slightly over in terms of the next part of the discussion? How do you want to play it?
I think I'd like to conclude this session just by very quickly, if they could, the panelists could answer that question about a key thing from the Scottish Government, because I think that would be a nice way to, think about what we need to do next as part of this, the next part of the discussion, Liz. So just very quickly, folks, just say what would be a key thing you'd like to see from the Scottish Government if they are here and listening. And it's like, could you do that for us, please? And this would really help. Just one thing, and obviously it's not Chatham House, but let's fire on. Let's say what we want here. Didn't pull your punches. So Val, one thing, what would it be?
I think for the Scottish Government to embody the principles of an anchor organisation. So to say, yeah, we're a huge anchor organisation, and this is how we're approaching the 5 pillars of community wealth building as a huge anchor organisation. And I think there's maybe just picking up on what Julie said previously, there's a kind of sense that if you take a community wealth building approach, then your local authorities, health boards, become anchor organisations. But they're all already anchor organisations, and the decisions that they're making and the way that they operate are already having an impact on sort of the economic footprint that they have. So I think it would be great to have some explicit communication from Scottish Government about their anchor approach.
Excellent, that's good. Very quickly, Calamine, your thoughts on this? One thing from you.
An understanding that one size doesn't fit all.
Nice.
To have a process or a policy that is Scotland-wide may work for an urban area, but doesn't work for a deeply rural area, or vice versa. To have the confidence to devolve power down to local areas to allow us to go about the business in a way that works for our area and not a way that works for the totality.
It's a good point. I mean, community wealth needs to have that ability to reflect the nature of that community in those individual places. Nice point. Julie, quickly, one thing, Scottish Government.
I'm not going to be quick, Neil, because I've got a list. However, I will start with a positive. I think it's fantastic that the Scottish Government have brought someone external in to provide challenge to their directorates and new ways of thinking. So that's my positive. The 3 things that I would ask. The first is to look at flexibilities around our anchor institutions who also have some degree of control over them nationally in terms of procurement frameworks, in terms of land and assets. We need to look at flexibilities there to allow those partners to play their local and regional anchor institution role. The second one is we need to invest in capacity to deliver community wealth building. And I'm grateful for the £3 million fund that we've got through the growth deal, but we need to see more of that. And the third area is have trust in local government to work with local communities and work in partnership with their anchor institutions to deliver community wealth building.
Great stuff. Brilliant. I'm glad that's all recorded from all of you. It's brilliant stuff. Thanks very much, people. That's been brilliant. Liz, over to you.
Okay, so the final part, we've got about 10 minutes left for this, I think. The final part of today's session is really about just having some discussion around the future of community wealth building and the programme that lies ahead. Really, we'd like to hear from you. It's kind of over to you now in the audience. And we want to know kind of really what ideas you might have, what needs you might have in terms of future training, future support, future collaboration. And I should say at the outset that And EDAS, we've been working on our new strategy for the next, certainly details in terms of the plan for the next year, but a 3-year strategy which we'll be promoting in April. And community wealth building is very much a part of that strategy and the future direction of travel, as is many of the points and the comments that we've made so far about well-being economy, the green net zero economy, and fair work, etc. So we're interested in all of this and how it links to how we can use really community wealth building to drive some of those real needs going forward. So really keen, I think, to hear. Neil and I are going to be discussing this with our Scottish Government colleagues very soon, in about a week's time. So it would be great to be able to, we've got our thoughts, but it'd be great to hear what you are thinking if you've participated as part of this series of events, or even if you're just here today and catching up. So I'd love it if we could actually get some people commenting in person rather than me having to peer with my glasses on at the chat box here at the side, which is not easy sometimes. But although I do see now, is it Debbie? Hold on, sorry, you're just coming in now. Gosh, can't get rid of the other. Oops, let's get rid of that. Debbie Carter saying maybe reflect on my question around collaboration. Okay, so more on collaboration then. Could we get some people to come in here with just some verbal thoughts and ideas? We've got, I don't know, how many people have we got in the room? I can't see that immediately
About
from
40.
the screen.
About 40.
Okay, so we've got 40 remaining here today. So I'm sure many of you got thoughts on this. I think I can see, is that a hand that's gone up?
Debbie. Debbie.
Debbie, yes. Okay, Debbie, could you come in now?
I could. I thought I'd rescue you with a.
Thank you. It's hard to read.
Just to elaborate on that point about the collaboration, I note from the presentations this afternoon that there's some commonality between some of the actions from the CLES action plans, which is no surprise, and as it should be. But I wonder whether areas around community benefit procurement frameworks and good employment charters, whether there's possibilities for collaboration either across different local authority areas or with Improvement Service or with EDAS or whoever it may be, either to develop those things or to develop and provide a bit more detailed guidance that would complement the guidance that's already available on the CLES website. So that was really a plea, really, if there's anything else.
Okay, Debbie, could you say, just for the benefit of everybody, where you're from and why this is of interest to you, what your role is in all of this?
Sorry, my apologies. I'm Debbie Carter. I work in economic development at Clackmannanshire Council. Our CLES action plan was published in December last year as part of our wellbeing economy pilot that we're running with Scottish Government. Whilst we continue with the strategic side of it through the wellbeing economy, we actually need to get on and deliver actions around community wealth building. And I think my interest is that, we're a tiny team in economic development. And, it would be great to have other economic development colleagues that are working through some of the same issues I am to collaborate with, whether it's through a community of practice on community wealth building or whether it's through training or whatever it may be.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I can see, again, peering at the chat box, we've got Sharon Rice-Jones. Sharon, would you be able to come in and give your comment in person? Are you willing to do that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
It's fine. I'm happy to do that. Sorry, I need to keep my camera off because I've got a terrible Wi-Fi. But
again, could you just share where you're from and what you're interested in this as well?
Yeah, I am the coordinator for Rural Perth and Kinross Leader, which is a European fund. And we're at the end of the programme of giving out money, but we're working very closely with the Scottish Government, the rural teams, to find a solution going forward. And they're keen to shake things up a bit and to do things differently. And we have worked in a very similar way to community wealth building for a number of years, in the way that it's a bottom-up approach, it's a community-led approach to giving out money, funds against applications. And we're very keen to see how we can do this. some of us have got community action plans in our areas, and I think it would be useful to see how we can find a way forward to use community wealth building process framework or build it into the future plans that we're developing. Okay.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks very much for that. I'm just looking, I'm getting multiple messages on different media here from our organisers. So I can see that we have, let's see, sorry, who do we have? We have David Brown. I think David Brown has a hand up. I can't see you on your screen, so apologies, David, but can you come in?
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, it was just a quick point, really. Neil mentioned early on in the presentation how important it is, and the big prize, the juicy prize, was the private sector and making sure that the private sector plays its part. But I'm not really hearing an awful lot about how the private sector is best engaged with. It's all about collaboration between third sector organisations. So what's the best way of achieving that? Because I think there is a huge appetite amongst private sector businesses to be more engaged, and they're all staffed by members of the community. There's a huge upsurge in interest in general sort of corporate responsibility activities, particularly if it relates to local communities. So there's a huge appetite there to be involved, and whether that's involved in think tanks or strategic groups. It would be nice to see more emphasis on how to engage the private sector more effectively.
Yeah, I agree, and third sector, as you mentioned there, David, yeah, as well. Okay, thank you. Thanks, David. We've also got John Semple. John, are you able to come in? I believe.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I'm a regeneration project officer at East Renfrewshire Council, and I suppose I've been involved in lots of aspects of community development for many years, both within and out with local authorities. And one of the things which comes up, which I think is particularly relevant to community wealth building, because I've seen on many occasions potentially great partnership working destroyed by politics with a small p, both within local authorities and within communities. And what would be quite useful to get would be, I suppose, some case study work, some feedback from people on how they have overcome these kind of problems in the work that they've done in relation to community wealth building. Because you can have a coalition of the willing, and yeah, you can do good stuff, but sometimes just with a little bit of sort of negotiation and with working, I suppose, with others who are a wee bit reticent to work with you to a greater extent, then a great deal more can be achieved. And sometimes it's just misunderstanding on people's point of view of what it is you're trying to achieve. So it would be good to get some feedback on those kind of things.
Okay, excellent. I think all of these are great suggestions. Neil, I think, are you feeling the same way? I think we can look at how we can incorporate. Sorry, you're on. There you go. You're back. Yes.
No, I'm feeling the good vibe. No, it's good. I think there's certainly something we need to think forward, work on moving forward. That's more interactive. That's more honing in on the practice. That's honing in on the sharing. I like the point that Julie's making about not competition. We need to kind of, like a scrum, get together and move forward together more in some of these issues. I think we need to be communities of practice, action, learning set, deep dives into practice. These are the sort of things I think would shape the next iteration of these sorts of workshops. I think that's what the movement needs. I think that's what we're hearing from the assembled. So it is all grist to the mill. It's all good, I think.
Yep. Okay. And just, I think probably finally, just again, because we're just about 2 minutes to go. David Somerville, I think you've made a comment in the chat box, but do you want to come in just with what you're saying here as well? I think it's a point of emphasis, really, building on what's been said before.
Sure. Very much supportive. This is more from a citizen's perspective, a citizen-led group perspective, and wondering how that impacts on just something being done differently up there, and how does this engage with others and align with the desire to have fairer Scotland and a greater reducing the democratic deficit. Any points, anybody?
Oh, so you want? Okay, we're looking for a. Now we're nearly out of time, David. So that was.
That could be the first question in the new session. How about that?
Yeah. I'm also conscious, forgive me, but I'm also conscious, I'm just being told that Barbara from North Ayrshire, if we get very quickly, if we can squeeze you in, Barbara.
Yeah, hi, sorry, I'm Barbara.
David,
and I work for the third sector interface in North Ayrshire. Yeah. And we are part of the capacity building team to work with third sector organisations to allow them to contribute to the community wealth building pathway. And I suppose for me, it's more about, I suppose, a better understanding between the organisations on the charter about how each of us work and how we can better collaborate, whether it's shadowing opportunities. I think just having a better understanding across the charter about how we can best work together, given obviously we're third sector, we tend to be a wee bit different. So it's just about building a better understanding across the charter, really.
Okay. I mean, again, I think just adds to some really great comments and commentary there that I think is just building on what we've achieved so far. I'm going to round things up now, and I just want to do some thanks to, obviously, to Neil for his sterling steering of these sessions and fantastic contributions in terms of sharing the knowledge, the wealth of information that exists through CLES on this subject, but also to Callum Ian, to Gordon, who you'll see is missing. He had to leave at the break, I'm afraid, but to Gordon, to Val and to Julie for their contributions today, which have really been top-notch, excellent and complementary. To Elaine and Alison, obviously, who do all the work in the background in organising all of these events, who, you know, we couldn't do all of this without you, clearly, and also to all of you who've stuck with us and have continued to participate as part of this programme. As I say, we're going to be looking at where we take this now. We're very much of a view that this is just the start of a journey. We know that community wealth building is being rolled out in many areas and still has to be rolled out in many areas. So we don't think this is the end. It's been an initial 5 series of events, but we were really keen to look at where we take it. We will take on board your feedback. If you go away and think of something that you should have said or you wanted to feedback, please do so. You know, please contact us at EDAS so we can build that in. As I say, we're meeting with our Scottish Government colleagues in about a week's time, so we will we'll certainly feed that back in. But really, I also just want to say it's been really enjoyable. I don't know about you, Neil. I found it very enjoyable these afternoon sessions. So I do hope we can meet again and continue to build on this really important agenda. So thanks very much, and we'll keep you informed of next steps on all of this. So everybody stay safe, keep well. We're nearly there. The end is in sight. Lockdown is ending. So we may even be able to meet in the same room next time. You never know. Okay, thanks everybody.